Hello, my name is Chris Snipes, and you are listening to The Melt. An entheogen is defined as a psychoactive substance that induces alterations in perception, mood, consciousness, cognition, or behavior for the purposes of engendering spiritual development within sacred contexts. So, what came first, the entheogen or the religion/mystery school? People have been going back and forth about that for decades, just as they've been going back and forth about whether or not drugs merely cause one to hallucinate, or whether they actually give one access to other dimensions or frequencies. And let's say that the religion or mystery school came before the entheogen use. Why add entheogens to the mix? At one time, the use of entheogens was widespread in a variety of religious rites and celebrations. Now it's limited to a few enclaves of Peruvian shamans, the Native American Church, and maybe Alex and Allison Gray's art colony. But it's seeing a steady resurgence as marijuana becomes legal for recreational use and magic mushrooms get decriminalized in places like Oakland and Denver. And, more than ever, research is being done into the spiritual, psychological, and mental benefits of entheogenic use. Today's guest, Thomas Hatsis, has written a book called Psychedelic Mystery Traditions, Spirit Plants, Magical Practices, and Ecstatic States, about just these sorts of things. I start off the conversation by asking him what put psychedelics on his radar.
When I was 18 years old, some friends of mine got some mushrooms and I tried them and I just really liked them, and I decided that I kind of wanted to know everything about them. I wanted to know what was going on. I felt like I had touched something like beyond our normal waking consciousness, and that thing was very real. And I definitely got ahead of myself in those days. I was trying to, this is, my late teens. I was like, what if I can prove scientifically that there's a soul using psychedelic,
I like it.
That kind of stuff. And I eventually just ended up using mushrooms for creative purposes mostly, and just to connect with people. In those days, my early 20s, I had a friend of mine's parents had a timeshare up in Lake George, New York. I'm in Portland now, Portland, Oregon, but I grew up in New York. And so we would go up to Lake George sometimes to just like party, and there was a beach right down by the lake that we had access to. So, we'd make big bonfires and we'd bring the guitars and the drums down there, and we'd eat mushrooms and we'd eat ecstasy and pass around bottles of wine and joints. And it was just great, just that connection to people, that connection to just life and breathing and art and magic. And then later on, I kind of got a little bit more, I don't want to say serious, that's the wrong word. I got way more, like mushrooms and even cannabis always had a spiritual side to me. But in the last, I would say 10 years or so, actually closer to 15 years, I've been making my own kind of spiritual practice and carving my own path using psychedelics. And that's pretty much brings us up to speed, and writing books about them. And that brings us to today.
Fantastic. Well, before you first took psychedelics, was that something that, did you just kind of stumble into the situation where it was available and it was a good time to do it? Or did you set like, did you have intentions? Were you interested in that leading up until that time?
Sure. So back then, this would be in 1998, we didn't really talk yet about intentions or integration or self-care or any of the other, buzz terms that are around today. I got into it because before that, I was always kind of just into like witchy things and kind of an Aristotelian idea of spirituality, like, using the elements and stuff and all the, the things that witchy people do. And when I was smoking cannabis, it was like, oh, wow, this is witchy as fuck. Like, what else is there, And, yeah, I had also, when I was even younger, and I was about maybe 12 or 13 years old, it was weird. I watched the movie Young Guns. I don't know if you remember that movie with Lou Diamond Phillips is in it. Charlie Sheen is. Oh no, he's in the first one. This was the second Young Guns. Anyway, there's a scene where they eat peyote. Now at the time when I was like 12, 13 years old, I had no idea what was going on. Like I had no reference for peyote at all. And then a few years later, I was like, that's what was happening. So I read books about native culture that used psychedelics and things like that at that time before I even tried even cannabis or mushrooms for that matter.
Gotcha. Yeah, I just asked because before I tried acid for the first time, I researched the shit out of it. I was just so fascinated by that. And I lived in a little Midwestern town, so I didn't even really have any hopes of ever coming across any, but I just devoured the whole metaphysical section of my junior high school library, which wasn't that vast. But of course, in there was psychedelic stuff, and I was just like, huh. And then you would see those movies that they show in school that were supposed to warn you against things like that, and that just made it more interesting to me. Like, that looks like fun. So in this book, which is called Psychedelic Mystery Traditions,
Mm-hmm.
you use the term entheogen as an adjective rather than a noun. What is that? And you also you have a whole, you divide theogens up in many, many different categories. Can you run over some of that with us?
Yeah, sure. So with the first part, with theogens, so theogen just means generating divinity in the sense that entheogen is generating divinity from within. But when I looked at all these ancient and some medieval records that dealt with magic and witchcraft and the use of psychoactives, and in some pagan religions as well, not every case could be classified as entheogenic. So I use the word entheogen, as you were saying, as an adjective, whereas I use psychedelic as the noun, or a plant medicine or a spirit plant. That's the noun. And entheogen is a kind of psychedelic experience. It's the kind of psychedelic experience where you generate divinity inside yourself. But what about when people would generate divinity outside themselves? Like, let's say, medieval ceremonial magicians who were calling up demons while getting high off cannabis and other incenses. Well, that's not really generating divinity inside themselves. That's generating divinity outside themselves. So I coined the term extheogenic, generating divinity, outside the self. With entheogen, the observer and the observed, unite as one. Whereas with extheogen, the observer and the observed remain two distinct entities. There's also, so another example of the theogen would be like, most people would agree that psychedelics do aid with creativity, right? I mean, I
Sure.
think so, and many people would agree with that, but we didn't have a word for that. Like this thing, this so universal that we all understand, yet there isn't a word for it. So I coined the word poetogen. Poetogen is when you use psychedelics for artistic purposes. And in that sense, it's like there doesn't need to be any divinity being generated at all. I leave out the prefix or the phenome theo. Actually, it's not a phenome. I don't know what that part of speech would be called. Anyway, I leave out the theo part for two of them, poetogen and pytheogen, because they could have nothing to do with generating divinity of any kind. Pytheogen, which I just mentioned, means using psychedelics to enact magic.
Mm-hmm. Cool. Okay, I like that. I think that's a long needed division of that category for sure.
Yeah, thank you. I hope so. I don't know if any of these words are going to catch on. I just, I love language and I love using language. So it's just like, oh, how can we play with language? And again, when you read the records, I mean, they don't all fall under the term of entheogen. So you have to come up with something else to call it.
Yeah, and I think it's a good time to introduce, excuse me, divisions like that into the public realm, because there's such a really intense and palpable psychedelic renaissance happening right now, it seems like, with all the
Yes,
yeah, with all the research that's happening. Ayahuasca is like every fucking place you turn. I mean, it's wonderful. I have mixed feelings, but most of them are positive. I think that that stuff should actually get out into the world a lot more. But as with everything, it's not for everybody. So yeah. So yeah, it's a great time to introduce those kinds of more detailed ways of dividing that huge category up. What do you think the primary difference? This is part of what you deal with in the book. The primary difference is between religion and magic, or is there a difference?
Well, in the ancient world, there was certainly a difference in that you could be executed for practicing magic, but nobody would be executed for practicing religion, unless it was an illegal religion, which there really weren't many. Like Christianity, I think, is one of the few in the Roman Empire that was considered illegal. But that would be the major difference. When you go back into the sources, religion was something that was done communally. It was done out in the open, so everybody could see and everybody participated. Magic was seen as subversive, and it was something done in private. And with magic, what you were doing was you were taking control out of the gods' hands and you were putting them in your own hands. And that was highly illegal during the days of pagan Rome, and actually the Greek state as well. We tend to think today that magic and witchcraft became illegal with the rise of Christianity, and it certainly was illegal under Christian Rome, but it merely adopted all of the pagan, proscriptions for magic and witchcraft. And in fact, in some ways, the later Christians even laxed some of the laws against magic. Whereas, so in the ancient pagan world, if you were caught practicing magic, they just killed you. Like there was just, it was a punishable, punishable by death. Now the Christians, they at least gave you the option to convert, and if you didn't convert, well, then they would kill you. But you had that option. But that would be the major difference. Now today, there's not much of a difference, I would say, between magic and religion. Like a lot of people see them as one and the same. And I mean, there's so much overlap there, and there was overlap in the ancient world too. I'm not saying there wasn't. I'm just saying that there is a nuance, and if you upset that nuance, you could get yourself definitely thrown in prison, but probably executed too.
Mm-hmm. You talk about early humans and sort of the environment that religion and these practices were born out of, and you mentioned that it was always important for early humans to assume agency.
Yes.
What did you mean by that?
So when you have to picture yourself as a primate, tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands of years ago, hundreds of thousands, easily years ago. And you're starving, hysterical, naked primate, and you don't know where thunder or lightning come from. You don't know where rain comes from. You don't even know where babies come from yet. You know that they come out of a woman's body, but you probably don't know how they got there in the first place. So in this kind of environment, there's type 1 mistakes and there's type 2 mistakes. Type 1 errors, type 2 errors. Type 1 error would be like, okay, I hear a rustle in the bush. I think it's a dangerous predator, so I assume there's a dangerous predator and I run. Now, there wasn't a predator there, but that's a mistake you made, because it's better to make that kind of mistake versus a type 2 mistake, or a type 2 error, which would be hearing the rustle in the bushes, thinking, oh, that maybe that's just the wind, but no, it turns out there's a lion back there, and now you are going to be dragged back to the den to be feasted on by the rest of the pride. So we today are the descendants of those people who were more likely to make type 1 errors, to assume agency to everything around them. But in this way, that connected, in my opinion, that connected people with there being higher things going on, higher agencies outside of, ones on the terrain.
Do you think maybe this had something to do with the root of where animism came from?
Yes, yeah, very much so.
Mm-hmm.
I think that's exactly where animism comes from. Just this idea of like, something as simple as, well, look at that rock over there. Well, rocks don't move. Well, how did it get there? Well, see how that line is moving? Yeah, well, it has there's something going on that makes it move. There must be something else that made the rock get there. We have to admit, this is before geology. This is before all of the advances and knowledge of the human race. So, our progenitors did their very best, but they didn't know what was actually going on. And out of that fear, they developed an intuition about the world around them.
Yeah, they were sort of hyper aware of everything.
Exactly.
Yeah.
You become hyper aware, and then you tap into what is actually there.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I like it. Very handy in that situation.
Oh, what's that? I'm sorry.
No, I said just very handy in a situation like that where your very survival could depend on interpreting something right or wrong.
Yeah, exactly. And so then you think about that. Over thousands of years of evolution, you're going to start picking up other just signals from around you. Mm-hmm. There are so many, signals around us all, today that we can't even pick up on, but they're there. And perhaps these, for lack of a better way of putting it, these occult forces and energies were some of the things that early people picked up on.
Absolutely. So many people think that entheogens, the use of entheogens, preceded religion, preceded religious practices and rites. But you don't necessarily think that. You think that religion was around before entheogens became a part of that. Can you tell us a little bit about what drew you to that conclusion?
Sure. The simple fact, one, that there were plenty of people that have religious and mystical experiences without the use of any kind of psychedelic whatsoever. It seems to be built into us. Now, psychedelics certainly help. I think they help. I think they're the best sacrament that there are, especially mushrooms. But that doesn't mean that the religious impulse grew out of psychedelia. Really, the only way that we can measure any of this is by looking at various just indigenous groups untouched by modernity that have more or less existed the way they've existed for thousands of years. Now, some of these groups have religion and have no concept of psychoactives whatsoever. Now, there are other ones who do have religion and psychoactives, but, we have to be able to explain, is it more likely that this one group that has religion just, developed it, even though they didn't have psychoactives or psychedelics? Or is it more possible that the religious impulse exists without them, and that when we discover psychedelics, we tend to kind of bring them into pre-existing beliefs we already have? At least that's my theory on it.
Do you think that there are any sort of, religion is a very broad term, but religious practices that did come out of entheogen use? Do you think that there is cases where that preceded that?
Absolutely. The Feast of Hathor would be a good example, where I believe it would be roughly our September 17th, but they didn't have September 17th back in the days of ancient Egypt.
Yes.
I think it's the month of Thoth is what they called it. But it's around our September 17th. And on that day, all over Egypt, people would drink mandrake beer because there was a myth about how the sun god Ra, who was pissed off at humans because humans were making fun of Ra and calling him old and useless as a sun god. So he sent Hathor to slaughter humanity. So Hathor's, just chopping people down left and right. She gets tired, right? And she falls asleep. Now, Ra, seeing this, is like, oh, shit, that's a lot of dead people. Maybe I didn't really think this thing through all the way. So he orders mandrake beer be brewed in, I believe it was the island of Elephantine, which is on the Nile River, and it was famous for having mandrake beer. And so they take the mandrake beer and they dump it into the streets where Hathor's sleeping. And so she wakes up and she's like, oh, there's all this blood, and she wants to drink more blood and wake up, and that was her breakfast, right? But because the mandrake beer was mixed in the blood, it mellowed her out, which I don't know if you've ever used mandrake, but I mean, I have. It'll, like, especially in an alcohol, it'll knock you. You're just like, yeah, I don't care about nothing right now. So every year, on September 17th, again, I believe, people in Egypt would drink the mandrake beer on the Feast of Hathor in honor of that particular psychedelic saving humanity. So this is absolutely an example of an ancient pagan festival, an Egyptian pagan festival that was 100% built out of the use of a psychedelic. However, the idea of religion, because they were talking about Ra in the story, existed before the mandrake beer and you know what I'm saying? So, like, they had religion before this. They just didn't have the Feast of Hathor until they started to, use mandrake beer for that kind of ceremony. Now, granted, they were using it in other religious endeavors at the time. Don't get me wrong. They just never used it for this particular, festival. Then, of course, you have another example would be the Feast of Dionysus. Now, Dionysus is largely considered the god of the grapevine, the god of wine. And that's definitely true in the beginning. But at some point along his journey in history, he became the god of intoxication, or a god of what the ancient Greeks called enthusiasmos, which means religious revelry. It's literally where Karl Ruck took the word entheogen from the Greek enthusiasmos. That's the root of it. So with Dionysus, we know that people weren't just drinking wine or different kinds of beers straight. They were often putting things like opium or mushrooms or cannabis or mandrake or henbane into them to enhance them. So, like and that would be another religion that absolutely was all about, being in, otherworldly states of consciousness.
Mm-hmm. Well, did the Eleusinian mysteries, did that go hand in hand with Entheogen, or did one precede the other?
So, Eleusis is tough. In psychedelic mystery traditions, I argue that an entheogen was used, but it's really, the Eleusis falls in that kind of middle ground where we're really not sure. If an entheogen was in they drink the kykeon that the participants would drink, and then they'd see Persephone rising from the dead. And that one's a difficult one. Now, for a long time, thanks to a book called The Road to Eleusis by Albert Hoffman, the discoverer of LSD,
Mm-hmm.
Robert Gordon Wasson, who famously ate mushrooms with Maria Sabina, and Karl Ruck, who coined the term entheogen. They wrote this book, and in it, they make the argument that ergot, which is the precursor for LSD, was actually in the kykeon. Now, I personally don't think that they make a very good case at all, and I know that it's accepted today by a lot of people, so your listeners might be, hearing me say this, say, what the fuck is this guy talking about? Of course ergot was in there. Well, I would implore you to read the Road to Eleusis very carefully and tell me what the arguments are. And I can do it right now. They're not very good. One argument they say is that the Rarian fields, which is where they grew the wheat in Eleusis, was across the way from the temple. So what? So what? There was a McDonald's not too far from where I lived in St. Louis. I didn't eat there. Proximity to a place doesn't, that doesn't mean anything.
Sure.
And the second thing they said is that, well, in the Homeric hymn to Demeter, it said that the kykeon contained 3 ingredients, which would be barley, water, and mint. And because ergot can grow on barley, that maybe that's what they're talking about. It's like, well, yeah, like it can grow on barley, but ergot is actually more found on rye. Like it's not as prevalent on barley at all. And so it would be very difficult, especially considered that there were hundreds of initiates at the same time going into the telesterion at the Temple of Eleusis, where they would have the vision and drink the kykeon, hundreds of people to rely on an ingredient that may or may not show up come that autumn, because again, it doesn't grow naturally, or it does. Wow, hold on a second. It does grow naturally on barley. It's not as common. The other problem you have with that is that, using ergot can lead to ergotism, which, you'll definitely have visions, but you might also have gangrene and your limbs can fall off. And we don't have any reports. I mean, for 2,000 years that the rites of Eleusis were going on, and there's no report anywhere of somebody having a gangrenous effect or anything like that. You really wouldn't want to mess with ergot, in my opinion. Now, where there might actually be room for an entheogen would be opium. In Greece, opium was very, very, very popular in ancient Greece. In fact, there was an area in Corinth called Macon, which means opium town, which is where that's where you went, you did your opium, you bought your opium. It was kind of like those opium dens of the 20s and 30s, but just now stretch it out to an entire town, and nobody is hiding the fact that they're using it. And now going along with this prevalent use of opium in all of Greece, we also have this bas relief that shows Persephone rising from the dead. And I have this picture in psychedelic mystery traditions, and in her hands she's holding snakes, wheat, and opium capsules. So, all right, well, what's going on there? Well, I think that there's some symbology what's happening here. The snakes represent the underworld, and there's really very little debate about that. Snakes represent the underworld in various Greek sources. The wheat represents rebirth, and the opium represents the bridge that gets you into the underworld so you could have this death rebirth experience. So if there was an entheogen at play at Eleusis, and again, we don't know, it was more probably opium than ergot. And I give a lot of other reasons why I think that. I mean, I could talk, honestly, Chris, for the rest of this interview, I could talk about why opium is a better candidate than ergot, all while saying we still don't know. But we'll probably move on if you want, or whatever.
No. I think those are great points. That totally makes sense to me. I could understand how you arrived to those conclusions for sure. Do you think that these substances, the entheogens, all the different theogens, induced people to see the hallucinations, quote unquote, that were appropriate to their belief system, or do you think that it actually gave them access to other dimensions or frequencies?
So that's a great question. I think the answer is both, because to those people, those areas that they were going to were different dimensions. When those Greeks at the rites of Eleusis, let's say for argument's sake, they were drinking opium there, right? When they went down there to have this experience, that to them was an otherworldly, other dimensional thing. Now, it was within the context of their time and place. And it always is. I mean, even today, the experience is within the context of our time and place. We speak of psychedelics in these broad cosmic terms, well, because, we've been to the moon. Or some people think we haven't been. Trust me, we've been to the moon. And, we have satellites up in space, and we know so much more. One of the big advances in the 20th century was learning how small we are in the universe and how little we know about how anything works at all. And that has greatly impacted, I think, the psychedelic experience. But that's not to say that somebody like when a medieval wise woman would use her magical ointment to enter the dream state, which was a very real world to these people. I mean, this is a very lucid, deep dream state. She was going to the other world. She was really having these interactions with her goddess in that world, and that goddess was really giving her, advice to heal her village, medical advice, how to make the crops grow, what herbs, to avoid and which ones to use, when's the best time to go hunting. I mean, these wise women, there was a time when they were revered in their communities. They weren't always hunted by the church. And anyway, sorry, getting off point. The fact is, in my opinion, when they were going into these other dimensions, they were, it was just as otherworldly to them as, when I smoke DMT and I open my eyes and it's before the Big Bang even took place.
And we will get to DMT for sure.
Okay, I'm jumping the gun on this.
No, not at all. So, okay, where in this timeline of all, well, actually, let me go back to another question that I thought of while you were saying all of that. In these mystery schools and religions, yeah, go for it.
Okay, sorry. In these mysteries, just get
schools and religions, with the groups that get together to do these things, were they hierarchical, or was it more like, I mean, like we're used to in Western organized religions, that there is a figurehead that is sort of the go-between in between the divine and the normal lay folk.
Sure.
But these seem to be, the mystery traditions seem to be more experiential. So did you have to go through some conduit, or was it more like those experiences gave you direct access to the divine?
I see. Yeah, great question. I think it's something similar to how, Catholic priests go about it. It is experiential, but again, to my grandmother, when she's praying in church, she's having an experiential, thing happening, experience. Like she's really in there and she really feels like Jesus is touching her heart. And just because that's not my belief system, well, it's worked for her for 90 some odd years. So, it's doing something for her. And I'm not so keen on that. On the idea that, for pagans it was experiential and for Christians they were being told. Because I mean, going back to the rites of Eleusis, every single initiate had with them a mystagogos, which was the Greek term for the person who would lead you through the mysteries. That was their guide. They were the priestesses who would dole out the kykeon. They were measuring out your dose for you in those days. So, if an entheogen or, opium, as I think was in fact in there. I think most religion is about direct experience, or at least, most religion that isn't cheap is about direct experience. And I mean, we are conduits for those kinds of experiences. So I guess I don't see much of a division. I mean, when St. Paul wrote to the Christians in Corinth, in the first letter to the Corinthians, and talking about how they're taking too much of the Eucharist and getting too messed up, and some people are even weak or dying rather, and some are getting ill. It's like, well, those are Christians that were taking substances to have whatever kind of early primitive Christian experience was available to them. If that answers your question, I'm sorry, I kind of went off there.
No, go off at will, please. No, that's perfect. So was there anything that differentiated religious rite, quote unquote, from revelry? I mean, or was there no line at a particular point?
See, yeah, there really isn't, because let's go back to like 187 before the Common Era. The Dionysian religion was totally a revelatory religion that was persecuted by the Roman state. Now, at the same time, you have the priests of Jupiter who are barred from drinking and taking any kind of psychoactive whatsoever. So you have, for the ancient world, just, I know it's a weird thing. The ancient world didn't work the way things work today. And, you have to make different dissections when you're dealing with the ancient world. It wasn't pagan religion versus Christianity or versus Judaism or anything like that. These were all different religions, some of which were legal, some of them were illegal. The Dionysian religion was legal one day, and then the next day it was illegal. And the people were executed. The followers of Dionysus were executed. At least the Roman faction were executed.
And I don't remember actually if it was in your book or in an interview that I heard about you, or with you, that even pagans and Christians, for instance, would co-marry. They would. I mean, and they're.
Oh yeah.
Yeah, I didn't realize that. I thought that they were like these hardened enemies. Just the impression that I got. No. Yeah, please.
Yeah, no. Well, that's the impression a lot of us have. I mean, that's the impression I had, before going into my research, so many years ago. But I mean, one of the things that the church fathers complained about the most was that Christians were marrying pagans. So they wouldn't have brought that up as often as they did if that wasn't happening. And then of course you see. just the influence of pagan elements into Christianity, we tend to think that that was a top-down thing, like it came from, the authorities above. I don't think it was. I think that it was more of a bottom-up, people just marrying each other, trying different things that work. This pagan general who's high up in the social hierarchy just so happens to fall in love with a Christian woman, and now they're, there's another thing we have to understand about pagan religion. Pagan religion morphed. There was no dogma about it. Like, I could worship Zeus, and I'm worshiping Zeus to help my crops grow, right? And then my neighbor says, Zeus, what the hell are you doing about? Crops, that's Saturn. You got to worship Saturn. So then I start worshiping Saturn for my crop. There's no heresy there. Nobody cares. Like, it's just like, oh, okay, well, Zeus wasn't doing your garden very well, so Saturn's going to do your garden well. That was how it worked. And when you have that kind of mentality, of course Christian elements are going to seep into paganism, and of course pagan elements are going to seep into Christianity. I mean, Christianity still was fixed in that time and place, especially later on when the Jews are actively rejecting the Christians. There was more division between proper Jews and Christians, and between different kinds of Christians, than there was anything between pagans and Christians. Pagans didn't care. They looked at Christians like, you're idiots. They didn't care, though. It wasn't that big a thing. They thought they were stupid. I mean, even the letter to Pliny, I mean, the people were executed eventually, and that's pretty serious, but that's only because they refused to offer wine and incense to a statue of the emperor, or I think it was some kind of, I don't know if it was a statue, but some, some kind of homage thing to the emperor. And that they didn't do that was illegal. So they were more executed for that than not, than being Christians, so to speak. You see what I'm saying?
Yeah, absolutely. And I think we have a certain attitude, or at least I do, and all of my extended family have an attitude that Christians are sober people. But your book would, and I mean, I knew it, but you elaborated on it in a way that was new to me. But Christians were not sober people at all. They used tons of entheogens, right?
Oh, yeah. Oh, yes.
And
yeah, like everybody else. Oh, what?
No, what sorts of things were the major ones that they were indulging in at that time?
So let's start with the man himself, Jesus. Now, I don't know if there was a historical like if there was a real person there. I go about my research as if there were a person there. I think that there's enough evidence to suggest a guy. I mean, I don't buy the miracle stuff. I'm not a Christian, but whatever. I think there was a dude there. So we have to just, make that allowance, right? That there was a guy named Jesus. Now, Jesus is called, in the New Testament, rabbi over 40 times, meaning that he was familiar with the Old Testament, with the Torah. Now, in the Song of Songs and in the book of Genesis, there's reference to a plant called cannabism, which is used to make the holy anointing oil, and also, made into incense to inhale when you enter the Holy of Holies. Now, for a long time, due to a mistranslation in the Septuagint, which is the Greek translation of the Old Testament, where they translated cannabism as calamus, which is a marshy reed-like substance. So this mistranslation kind of sat there for centuries until an anthropologist named Sula Bennett, she was in the 1920s or 1930s, around there, I think the 20s. Anyway, she looked at all the linguistic research and the etymological research, and she's like, no, cannabism is cannabis. And look at all these other languages, surrounding languages in the East, like this Assyrians, they call it cannabu. Like the Babylonians have some kind of canna base for the word. In that area, every single, so the point essentially Sula Bennett made was, in all of these areas, in this, surrounding Jerusalem, cannabis is some kind of canna word, right? So why should cannabism be any different? It sounds like every other word at the time for cannabis. There's also other clues in the Song of Songs that says that cannabism is grown in exotic gardens with other exotic plants. Well, you can't really grow a marshy reed in a garden. You can grow cannabis, though, and it was an exotic plant. It came from the East. So Jesus, should he have existed, what I'm getting to with all this, would have known about cannabism. He would have known what it was, or he would not have been a rabbi. He was very familiar with the Old Testament. In fact, his entire ministry was all about correcting the Old Testament and saying, oh, this is the new covenant, right? So you can't do that unless you're familiar with the Old Testament. So he seems to have been, if he did live at the time. So on top of this, one of Jesus's primary miracles was casting out demons, right? Now, how did people in those days cast out demons? Well, when you look again at the ancient sources, mandrake, the highly psychoactive mandrake, that's what people used to cast out demons. And in one point in the New Testament, I think it's in either Matthew or Luke, or maybe actually even in both, Jesus sends out his disciples with an ointment and says, go heal, those are, who are possessed. Well, that was most likely a mandrake ointment. Well, none of the disciples were physicians. So where did they learn how to do this? Well, they had to have learned from Jesus himself. So again, there's no solid evidence that Jesus, existed, and two, knew about psychedelics. But if the man did exist and you place him as a teacher, a rabbi, and a healer in the first century of the Common Era when he lived, well, he would have probably been using the medicines that other people from that time and place used. Unless you believe in the miracles, which I personally do not. I think that he was using the same techniques every other healer used.
I'm sorry, go ahead. I didn't realize you weren't done. Please go ahead.
Oh, well, I was going to then get into Corinthians, but if you were going to say, because there's more, but I was done with that particular section.
No. Keep going. It was just a sideline. Yeah.
So earlier, I'd mentioned Paul's letter to the Corinthians. And in this, he says that the Christians are taking too much. Some of the rich Christians are, since they don't have to work in the fields, they're showing up to the essentially to the party early, and they're pre-gaming, and by the time the poorer people that have to work in the fields have to come out, come out of the fields and then get to enjoy the party, well, they've already, the rich people have already drank all the wine and eaten all the Eucharist bread. And because they've done this, some of them are getting too drunk, or they're getting ill, or they're dying. Well, wait a minute, we have to ask ourselves, what could have possibly been in the Corinthians Eucharist that could cause you to get sick or die if you take too much of it? Maybe a mushroom. Maybe, definitely opium. Certainly mandrake. Absolutely henbane. Not cannabis, so we could rule that out. I mean, you can take as much cannabis as you want. It's not going to kill you. So, we can rule certain things out, but we could also say, well, maybe these things were in there, because what else would cause that? Wine is not going to kill you. I mean, you could get sick, you definitely get ill, but you're probably not going to die from it. There was probably something else in there. And, and again, at that time, these are converting pagans, right? Paul is trying to convert the pagan empire. So you have to think of these Corinthians. Yeah, they're Christians now, but last year they were all pagans. So they still had these pagan ideas of maybe, hey, let's bring, these same mandrake beers, these same opium wines. Yeah, fuck it. Let's bring it to, Sunday church, the Mass, and have a feast. Why not?
And they were allowed to do that, right?
Yeah, well, so the Didache, which is a really early Christian document, it's funny because it's ambiguous. It says that, the Bible says it's okay to drink. Of course, God wants us to be happy. Just don't drink to excess. Well, I mean, you don't really know you're drinking to excess until you get there. So there's probably, all these Christians that are drinking. Oh, shit, I drank to excess. All right, got to stop now. There's also the document of Second Esdras, which I think, and along with a few other colleagues of mine, think does show a Christian having a really deep entheogenic experience in this, and having a vision of Jesus coming back, to save everybody from Rome. And it's a pretty interesting document. I go over it in Mystery Traditions. The chapter's called, I forget the chapter number, but it's called The Firelight Cup. if your readers are interested, I get into ancient, like this is like the earliest, where we have some pretty concrete evidence of Christian psychedelia. You know, again, the idea with Jesus is all speculative.
Mm-hmm. Sure.
You know, because we don't know if he even existed or not. And even with the Corinthians, it's speculative. I mean, I think they were definitely throwing some additives into their wines, but it's still speculative.
Mm-hmm.
What?
No, go ahead, please.
I was just going to say, and then, you know, really early on, like the first great Christian apologist, Origen, I mean, he even recommends, you know, taking mandrake. The 5th century bishop from Syria, Theodoret, I mean, he wrote that he used to love to, you know, quote unquote, quiet his mind by, you know, ingesting opium and then reading from the Gospels. You know, and he had no qualms about saying this.
What about the Gnostics? Were they known to use?
Yes, some of them. Let me turn this off. So yeah, the Gnostics. Wow, where to begin with them? So Gnostics, one of the problems with Gnostics is that all the best information we have from them comes from their enemies, not really anything about them taking substances themselves.
Sure.
But that doesn't mean that they weren't doing it, especially with Irenaeus' treatment of Marcus, who was a Gnostic. He was a Valentinian Gnostic who kind of broke off and started his own church. And in his description, in Irenaeus' description of what Marcus was doing with his people, you know, his initiates, he said that he would make them drink one of his, at the time it was called Pocola Amatoria, which we today, if you adjusted for time, would call it ecstasy. So Marcus was a guy that he would invite these people into his home, women and men, and he would definitely get them really high off of something and then perform his ceremonies for them. So we know he was doing that. There's good evidence for Carpocrates as well. He was an Alexandrian Gnostic in Egypt, and there were a few, I believe Epiphanius alludes to him using some kinds of psychoactives in his practices. Simon Magus is another Gnostic who seems to have used psychoactives in his practices to initiate people in kind of the way Marcus did it. We also have this interesting ceremony, Gnostic ceremony, called the Mystery of the Light Maiden. And in the Mystery of the Light Maiden, I got to get into a little Gnostic theology real quick, or what I'm about to say is not going to make any sense.
Sure.
So many Gnostics, and when I use the word Gnostic, I am speaking of a broad category. In the same way, if we were to talk about fast food restaurants as a broad category, like Taco Bell is very different from McDonald's, but they're both fast food, think of Gnosticism the same way. So when I use it, I mean as a very broad term. In many Gnostic beliefs, there was this one supreme being who was beyond all space and time. Humans cannot know of this supreme being any more than a rock can know what a Mercedes is. It's just not possible. Now, out of this supreme being, different entities or aeons formed that were part of the essence of the supreme being. So what I mean by that is this supreme being was all-knowing, right? So knowledge came forth as an entity. This supreme being lived forever. So eternal life spread from this being as an aeon, right? This being was loving. So love spread forth as, and anyway, so these aeons all created what was known as the pleroma. The pleroma is what Christians, Orthodox Christians, I believe, took the ideas of heaven from. This is where the celestial heavenly bodies all lived, was the pleroma. Pleroma, just for your listeners' sake, is a Greek word that means the fullness or the all. So like a heaven or the ultimate reality. So now one of these aeons that sprang forth from the supreme being was wisdom, known as Sophia, which is again the ancient Greek word for wisdom, Sophia, right? Now, Sophia had unnatural intercourse with herself and gave birth to a bastard offspring child named Yaldabaoth. Yaldabaoth was responsible for creating the material world. Essentially, when ancient Jews, well, even modern Jews today talk about Yahweh, Gnostics called Yahweh Yaldabaoth. That's why the words are so similar, Yahweh, Yaldabaoth. So now Yaldabaoth, and one of the things we should say about Gnostics, they were, at least those that had this particular frame of spirituality, very anti-Semitic. They believed that, you know, the God that gave the Ten Commandments, right, Yahweh, was an inferior God. This was just a bastard offspring from Sophia, who actually got kicked out of the Pleroma for having this unnatural intercourse with herself and bringing forth material existence. Everybody still with me?
Yes, and he wasn't that deity also known as the Demiurge?
Yes, exactly. The Demiurge.
Uh-huh.
Yes, the creator. Yes, the Demiurge. Exactly. That's the same being. That's Yaldabaoth, is the Demiurge. So now, getting back to the mystery of the Light Maiden, what this had to do, we have this one reference in a poem called the Ode to Sophia, where they mention this beautiful chamber, you know, like where the room where this ritual would take place had all these beautiful, you know, throw pillows and carpeting and rugs and things, and they mentioned the burning of an incense made from the Indian leaf. Now, my colleague Chris Bennett goes into very excellent linguistic evidence as to why that Indian leaf is probably cannabis. So what happens is, in this rite, Sophia, we're not told how, but she would choose 7 women and 7 men who would enter into this bridal chamber, this highly decorative chamber with the cannabis fumes, you know, smoke going everywhere, and would have this orgy. This orgy would turn the 7 women into Sophias and the 7 men into cosmic Christ, thereby allowing the actual Aeon Sophia back into the Pleroma. That is an example of a Gnostic entheogenic practice, which I know it took a lot to get into it, but you know, you have to understand the theology behind it in order to see what's going on.
Absolutely. Some things cannot be summarized.
Of course, yeah. And Gnostic theology is one of those things that's very difficult, especially psychedelic Gnostic theology is very difficult to summarize.
Yes, absolutely. I had 2 shows with a fellow named Lawrence Gallion, and he knows a lot about Gnosticism, and most of those 2 shows, which were almost 2 hours long apiece, were just on Gnostic theology. So it's
Sure.
it's complex stuff. I love it. I find it really, really fascinating. So
It is.
why do you think that the line began to be drawn between the mystery schools that became religions and solo practitioners or smaller groups of practitioners?
Sure. Well, mostly because it was done in secret, and that is mostly what made up the definition of like illegal magic, was magic done in secret. So let me say again that or actually I haven't said, let me back up and say that there were certain, so like soothsaying in Rome at different times was totally illegal. As long as it was done in the public square and everybody was there to hear it and it wasn't done in private, nobody cared. It was okay. Now, the Emperor Augustus, I mean, he had them all expelled, and so did his one of his best friends, Agrippa, did the same thing. So you don't, it mostly had to just really do with being secretive. That's really where the line was drawn, because when you did it out in the open, people could see, are you really calling on the gods, and are you besieging them for your help? Whereas in private, nobody could tell, and these were very, powerful forces. So if you didn't do it properly, people thought that, this would bring, ruin to the entire state. So that's what made it illegal, and that's where the line was drawn, mostly between, private and public. Did it in public, some things you couldn't do in public, but things like, again, prophecy in public was totally fine.
Mm-hmm. When did the sort of satanizing of paganism and animism begin? What was the context that happened?
Well, that was a slow process over many centuries. That's a really, really big question. So let's see, the satanizing of them. I mean, I would say almost immediately. The idea, and first I would even argue that what was satanized first were the aeons that the Gnostics had. Now, also something else we have to remember that I should get out there. When I say Orthodox, I mean the group of Christians that won all of these fights. And when I say Gnostic, I just mean the people that more or less lost. But Gnostics all saw themselves as Orthodox, and many Gnostics did not get along with each other. Like I mentioned earlier, the Valentinian Church that Marcus was a part of, they disagreed so much that at one point they split between an Eastern faction and a Western faction. So we shouldn't think of it as, well, the Orthodox against the Gnostics, and the Orthodox just beat the crap out of them, and now we have Orthodox Christianity. No, all of these groups were all competing for, center stage, and all of them were condemning each other's beliefs. Getting back to the idea of demonizing the devil, that I would say actually began with Yaldabaoth. I think that Yaldabaoth was the first concept of that satanic figure in Christianity, the person who robbed human beings of their spirituality by creating the material world.
And when you get the figure of the shaman, where does the role of the shaman fit into this timeline? And because that's a completely different interaction with the entheogens. Tell us a little bit about that.
Sure. So shamans, they appear on the stage, centuries before pagan Rome, but centuries before, Egypt and even Sumer. We don't know when the first shamans came about, but there is that famous drawing in the Tassili caves in eastern Algeria. It's popularly called the bee shaman, and it shows this person that seems to be in the ceremonial dress that has a mask on that kind of looks like a bee, and hence the name bee shaman, but is also clutching mushrooms in their hands. So it has been argued that would show, that's the earliest depiction we have of a shaman using entheogens, and that was during the Roundhead period of artistic development in the Tassili caves. If your listeners are familiar with the Tassili cave art that shows the bee shaman, which I'm sure some of them are, they might not know, and this is pretty cool, that the art, you could actually detect 5 different stages of artistic development in those caves. The first stage is the bulbous stage, which starts around 10,000 to 8,000 years before the Common Era. And the bulbous from the genus of large hooved animals like giraffe and buffalo, which are scrawled on the cave walls. And the second stage is the Roundhead period, around 6,000 or so years before the Common Era, and that's where you have the bee shaman. Now, the thing is, after that period, the other 3 advancements in artistic development, they're like, holy shit, they're so abstract and so much more detailed and involved that it's like, it's just interesting that you have, etchings on the wall that are, definitely impressive for that time and place. Then you have the mushrooms come in, and then all of a sudden you have these very abstract cave paintings. So I think that kind of tells a little bit of the story of how mushrooms, at least in particular in this time and place, influence cultural development.
Absolutely. Do you buy the intoxicated monkey Terence McKenna?
The stoned ape theory.
Uh-huh.
No, I don't. I think that there are better explanations. So my whole thing is this: if you were to take the stoned ape theory, I forget where McKenna has it, but he has it, hundreds of thousands of years in the past. I think that if you were to take it and update it up until about 10,000 before the Common Era, and show the influence of psychedelics on culture and art, not on physiological evolution, I think you can make a case there. But I think better things explain, the development of humans than mushrooms.
Sure. Well, and he also has something taking place in history too, which I find interesting, is that, mushrooms in certain areas only grow at certain times of year, so they had to find a way to preserve those for the various religious ceremonies when they weren't actually growing. So they preserved them in honey. So eventually honey is going to ferment, and that is where the shift in McKenna's mind from, say, something like psilocybin went to something like alcohol, like mead. Do you think, that's pretty simplistic, but do you think that there's any truth to that at all?
Given the time and place we're talking about, it's definitely possible. Anything's possible when we're talking about prehistory. I don't think so, personally. I think that in mystery traditions, I try to trace as best as I can the cultural and mythological evolution of alcohol. And while they do speak about, some writers speak about the thyrsos, which is the staffs that different worshippers of Dionysus would collect various herbs to put into their wine. It could have. I think that people were putting mushrooms in their wine without the whole fermentation honey thing, like that, like with McKenna's whole thing. I don't think you need it. We have a vase from an Anos, which is a place in modern day Turkey, this Anos graveyard that I think clearly shows people adding mushrooms into wine. Now, is the fermentation theory, could that have happened? Again, it's possible, but you don't need that to make the case, I guess what I'm saying. And I'm going to just, invoke Occam's razor on this one. And just, if there's no need to go there for it, you may as well not. It complicates the issue, and it's already a very complicated issue. But trying to, the problem with it is that, and a lot of people that get into psychedelic histories, they think it all revolved around the mushroom. So they come up with these really ingenious ways to make there be a mushroom, present at all places and all times. And you don't need it. The earliest evidence, like really hardcore evidence as far as carved in stone and put in writing, we have for entheogens. I mean, you're talking about cannabis and opium and mandrake, not mushrooms at all. Maybe the Mycenaean people, the precursors to the ancient Greeks, yeah, they were probably using mushrooms at Mycus. We get mycology from, that word, from that settlement. So, yeah, they might have been, but that doesn't mean that when alcohol entered Greece, like, they already had mushrooms. Alcohol came from the East. Which is why, we call it alcohol. Like, every Islamic word is al this, al that, So alcohol is just another, Eastern word that made its way to the East. And I think that the Greeks already had things like opium and mushrooms and cannabis, definitely already by that time.
And that also is the beginning of alchemy.
Yes, exactly. Alchemy is another one. I mean, so Terence McKenna, like, I grew up reading Terence McKenna. I love Terence McKenna. Brilliant philosophizer of psychedelia, not the best historian, in my opinion.
Yeah, he was a good storyteller.
Great storyteller. One of the best.
And he was very good. I mean, he never stated any of this stuff like it was just the undeniable gospel. He was always very self-deprecating and like, I could be full of shit, but this is what I'm coming up with, like.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
And that's fine,
Absolutely. So then there's alchemy in all of this. Do you think alchemy was more the precursor of science or of magic? Or is there any difference, once again?
Oh, wow. That's a great question. Definitely the precursor of science. I'm going to say that I believe that there was a time when magic, alchemy, and medicine were all the same thing. Because think about, when you take a medication, that is alchemy. You are trying to attain a higher state than the one you're in. So I think that it's just, and then you have Zosimus the alchemist back, in the early written days that was saying things like, he's condemning magicians for using cannabis. Well, he's an alchemist, and cannabis definitely had a role in alchemy, really from the beginning. Alchemy began in China, and it's rolled its way, all the way west, and eventually ends up in Western civilization and in Rome. But I mean, it picked up a whole lot of Persian ideas, Hindu ideas, and Chinese ideas, and they all used psychoactives. Really early stories of Li An, who was an early alchemist. I mean, he was trying to achieve a state known as Shame, and this was this higher state of awareness that you attained if you entered the afterlife and came back from the dead, essentially. And he obtained it by using things like cannabis and foxglove, to get himself there, and a dog, by the way. Who also came back from the dead and was revered, and one of his disciples. I mean, alchemy, all the way, to the earliest days of people using plants for medicine and alchemy, magic. It's all rolled up. I mean, there's like a 0 point where they're all the same thing in history, definitely.
Yeah, and it seems like slowly but surely they're kind of moving back towards that wholeness again.
I agree with you 100%, Chris. They absolutely are. And we're seeing it today. Again, we were talking earlier about, how, back in the day, magic and religion were two very different things. And the differences could get you executed. Today, people see magic and religion as very much the same. And also alchemy is also kind of wrapped up in there. So, the idea of alchemy is just the idea of becoming something better than the previous form. I mean, that's if you were to break alchemy down to its fundamental sentence, that's all it is. So for an alchemist, gold evolves. It starts off as lead, and then it becomes copper, and then it becomes silver, then it becomes gold. So with a lot of these, psychedelic elixirs, what these alchemists were trying to do was go, for lack of a better way of putting it, go from silver to gold. They're currently at silver, they're trying to go to gold, and so that's what they would use some of these psychoactives for.
Well, and something I find fascinating too is that at least entheogens in a religious context seem to lend themselves more to getting in contact with some sort of inner or outer divine. Whereas in shamanism, in that context, it's often seen as having something to do with healing. It could be spiritual, could be physical healing. Was there any of that healing aspect in those earlier mystery schools? Or was it just spiritual?
Oh, no, absolutely. So probably the best example would be the temples of Isis in Egypt, where people would go there, and you would ingest opium. Now, not for its pain-killing and euphoric effects, although those were absolutely recognized and enjoyed, but to actually knock yourself into the other world where you would meet Isis, and then she would heal you in the dream state. So that idea of going into another world, going into the other world that, which exists behind the veil, and bringing information back, that is the essence of what shamanism is. Now, that could be done through drumming, fasting, dancing, or psychedelics, whatever the case is, but people were definitely doing that. Yeah, at least in Egypt, in healing temples, I would say. And we also have other areas where we just don't know, like at the bottom in Italy, Lake Bracciato, there's a submerged city called La Marmota. We get the word marmot from marmota. And diver excavators actually uncovered this room that seemed to be in dedication to a great goddess, with statues of this poppy goddess, and they found opium products in there as well. So it can be argued that people would enter this room, they would take this opium for the same reason, that people would go to these temples of Isis in Egypt, only this is in Italy. All over the ancient Mediterranean, we have evidence of this poppy goddess. So, we don't exactly know how she was worshipped, but we know that she was really popular. I mean, she's found over in Sumer, in Egypt, in Rome, in Greece, everywhere. So, our best guess is that she was revered, for this ability, as we know about the temples in Egypt to Isis, that she was probably revered for her ability, the opium's ability, I should say, to get you into a transcendental state to meet that particular goddess.
Interesting. When do you think, and what was the process that entheogens it seems like they've slowly been scrubbed out of many Western religions? Like, there's no, maybe the token chalice of wine in Catholicism, but other than that, it's highly frowned upon. Why do you think that happened? Why do you think that manifested? And would we have a war on drugs if we still had entheogens in our religious ceremonies?
Well, in reverse order, no. To answer your first question, so that seems to have happened. That was a series of events that took place in the late 1800s into the early 20th century. Starting off with, so up until the mid 1800s, I'll just as one example, Christmas was a debaucherous affair. People got absolutely hammered. They would put on costumes like people doing Halloween. Christmas up until the mid 1800s was closer to New Year's, as far as how people celebrated it, to the family-friendly version we have today. Now, it was actually Queen Victoria and a few others who turned Christmas into a family-friendly holiday. With America being a Christian nation and having Christmas itself associated now with soberness instead of debauchery and focus on children and, the good tidings and family, that was pretty much the first death blow to the culture, quote unquote, of intoxication for American Christians. Then, of course, a few decades later, you get the war against drugs and the racist implications of all of that, and demonizing of Mexicans, demonizing of black people for using cannabis. All of that contributed to this. Now, we're no longer living in those kinds of times, and people are rediscovering that these plants and fungi have been a part of spiritual celebration and intoxicated revelry for millennia, and that maybe it's time to kind of ease up the restrictions on that, because people need an outlet. And I understand that the what could be called the recreational use of mushrooms might be frowned upon, and there are some ways of using mushrooms that are probably not too that I wouldn't recommend, I'll just say. But some people would call what I do sometimes recreational. Like if I get together with my friends and it's a warm summer night and we make a large fire, we go to the coast here, on the beach, and we eat some mushrooms and we dance around it. Well, that's really spiritual too, and it's like you can't always separate the spiritual from the recreational, I think. So, and maybe we're relearning that, to answer your question.
Absolutely. Again, full circle.
Yeah, full circle.
Yes, because it's marijuana is legal where you're at, right?
Yes, cannabis is legal here in California. Well, in Oakland, California, all plant medicines are legal. In Chicago, plant medicines are legal, and in Denver, psilocybin mushrooms are decriminalized. And I think that's in Santa Cruz also, plant medicines are decriminalized.
Interesting. But by plant medicines, you mean psilocybin?
Yeah, even though psilocybin, they're technically mushrooms, they do fall under the colloquial kind of category of plant medicine.
Yeah.
But plant medicine typically means mushrooms, ayahuasca, ibogaine, cannabis.
So in those places, ayahuasca is legal?
Oh, yeah.
No shit.
In Santa Cruz and in Oakland and Chicago. Well, no, it's not legal. It's decriminalized.
Oh, I see. Yeah.
It's decriminalized.
They're not going to try and bust a big ayahuasca ring. But if you do it in the privacy of your own home and, don't put any neon signs out, then you probably will do it uninterrupted.
Yeah, so we can, a good way to look at it, there was somebody in Denver that just got his house, or this was a few weeks ago, or about a month ago, and I don't know what happened to it, but it's promising in that this dude had this ridiculous grow operation going, feds bust down the door, guns ablazing, the whole thing, right? Mm-hmm. They didn't do anything. They took the mushrooms and left, and that was it. The dude, I don't think, he wasn't arrested, nothing. Mm. That's what decriminalized is. Now, I don't like the feds taking people's medicine. That's ridiculous. But, they could have been far worse. He could be sitting in prison right now, and chances are he's not going to prison at all. Mm-hmm. That's decriminalized. Legalized, actually, if we want to get into that, legalization is actually a trap. People out there, if you're opting for legalization in your state, you might want to consider decriminalization instead, because legalization doesn't mean what people think it means. Or at least in places like Oregon, it doesn't mean what people think it means. Legalization in most places means legal in government-appointed and approved facilities.
Interesting.
And so here in Oregon, we're actually fighting against legalization. I was supposed to go speak in front of the city council next Wednesday, but now because of coronavirus, it got canceled. So we're hoping to be rescheduled ASAP, whenever they can. I actually just got the email this morning, and I was on the phone with a buddy and a colleague of mine who's also in decrim, and they're like, "What's going on?" Because what we did was we put our requests in all at the same time, so that the entire block for this particular city council meeting will all just be on decriminalization. Usually with city council meetings, it's all different. Different topics that people want to address. This one in particular, because it was a concerted effort by a couple of us that are kind of assholes and want to be heard, we made it so it's just us that are going to be speaking this morning. So our city council is just going to be getting punched in the face over and over and over again about why decriminalization of plant medicines is the right approach.
Interesting. I didn't realize the difference between those two things. Thank you for...
Yeah, there's a big difference. So I would implore everybody, and it's going to be different from state to state. I'm speaking from the Oregon standpoint. So what I'm saying might not be true in your state. I know in Washington, D.C., they put decriminalization efforts forward. So I could be, it might not apply to your state, but definitely look into it, and do not be, I guess what I'm trying to say, don't be fooled by the word legalization. Definitely read the initiatives, read the bills, and make sure that legalization doesn't mean, legalization for these people, not for other people. Because in Oregon, it's just business as usual. And anybody, so in Oregon, and just to give some people, your listeners, if I may, something to look out for, if you read these initiatives in your home states, and they're going to be coming, so definitely check them out. If it says that they're not doing anything to rewrite current laws, or that their entire initiative is alongside or parallel with existing laws, do not get behind that, because that's just the same old racist bullshit that we've had now for a century, really, where historically discriminated, marginalized, disenfranchised people are all cut off from these medicines, and it's essentially just for rich white people. And that's what they're trying to do in Oregon. They're trying to make it just available for, they want to legalize mushrooms, but only if you pay $800 to $1,000 and go to their clinic to have this experience. Well, what if I don't want to go to your clinic? What if I've been working with a facilitator or a shaman now for years, and this is the person I trust, and they're not approved by your standards? No. The answer to that is no. These are Gaia-given rights that every human being on the planet has the right to take into their bodies or not. And there should be no government interference whatsoever. There should be no corporate interference. That's another thing. Legalization opens the door to big pharma. So if you want big pharma coming into your state and taking over everything and commodifying mushrooms and destroying them all in the name of the profit motive, then definitely vote for legalization. If you want to keep big pharma out so that there's no profit motive at all, decriminalization is the way to go.
Good to know. Thank you.
Please. And let me just say, of all the bullshit I've been talking for this past hour and how long, 20 minutes, what I just said is the most important thing you need to know.
Shall we end it there?
If you'd like.
You looked a little sad there for a second. Well, I was going to ask one more question, so maybe I'll just go ahead and ask that.
Absolutely.
I want to be cognizant of your time. So I don't hear in these discussions a whole lot said about salvia. Do you know anything about Salvia Divinorum and how it fits into any of these timelines, or what the lineages are, what it is used for in its usual cultural context, which I think is in Oaxaca, Mexico? Have you done it?
So, okay, my thoughts on salvia. First, they would absolutely salvia is covered under decriminalization, like ayahuasca and ibogaine, and under legalization, unless it's made legal, or all those other things, it's not. And I think it's legal in some places, but the short answer to your question is I don't know shit about salvia.
Okay.
I haven't studied it at all. I've never taken it. Most of my research deals with European Western civilization. So the stuff Mexico, Oaxaca, I don't really know much about that at all. So anything I say on salvia would be ignorant at best. and
Fair
just
enough.
downright stupid and arrogant at worst.
I just have experienced it several times, and I found it to be quite powerful, but it's really lacking in a lot of dialogues. And I was just wondering if you had something to add to it, or you had any experience or whatever. But hey.
Well, tell me a little of your experience, because again, I don't know much about it, so I'd be interested in hearing yours.
Well, it's illegal now in the state that I'm in, but before it became criminalized, I guess would be the proper term, I bought a lot of it at the head shops that were selling it around town. And so I started doing experiments with it. I mean, I've just started smoking it, but in a not in a context of like right before I go into an amusement park or something like that, in a mindful context. And it was such a distortion of time. Every single time it took me by surprise. At one time, a friend of mine left his bong over here, and I put some of it in the bong, which I think is the way that you're supposed to smoke it, so that you can make sure and get a good hearty lungful of it. And I took a couple of hits really, really quickly, and almost immediately, as I was blowing the second hit out, I lost track of time so overwhelmingly that I couldn't tell whether I had just been sitting here smoking it for 30 seconds. I didn't know whether I'd been sitting here for hours. My just sense of time was so utterly distorted. I got so discombobulated that I thought, wait, maybe I have house guests. Maybe I've been in here doing this so long that I'm being rude and they're like waiting for me to come back into the living room. And so I, for some reason in this state of mind, it made sense to go check on my friends by walking backwards into the living room.
Awesome.
Sounds so silly, but it made sense at the time. And
Ain't that the way, right?
yes. And of course they weren't there. And of course it had been just a matter of minutes since I'd done it, but it was so discombobulating. And it's a very, you're in and out in 15 or 20 minutes. So it's kind of like DMT. So I hear. I've never done DMT, and I really would love to do it. So there's all the distortions that you feel are bookended in a very short period of time, but so much can happen in that state, especially since your sense of time is so distorted that I don't know, it's just really hard to describe. As you know, it's hard to bring back and articulate these experiences, when they're so
Yes.
otherworldly. Yeah
they are.
No reference points.
Yeah.
Yes. So
Hard.
you've had experiences with DMT, right?
Oh yeah.
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 Does that doesn't fit? That's not legal under any circumstance at this point, is it?
No. So it's weird because NNDMT, or what ayahuasca technically is.
Mm-hmm.
So the Banisterius caapi, which is the vine, and the chacruna leaf, which is the leaf that you put together to make ayahuasca, both of them are totally legal by themselves. They're illegal if you put them in a pot and boil them for 12 hours. Then they're illegal. But as separate entities, they're not illegal at all.
Gotcha. Yeah, that what's up with that?
It's the stupidity of what's up with up until, was it maybe 5 minutes? Oh no, cannabis. Well, I don't know if it still is, but at least up until 5 minutes ago, cannabis was Schedule 1 along with heroin and crack. So you don't exactly have intelligent individuals making these decisions. So,
exactly.
I mean, it's ridiculous that just how. We could talk about the war on drug. Well, no, it's not going to.
Yeah, that's it. It's just enraging. But whiskey is legal. It has such a great track record.
It has a great track record. No, it has a horrible track record.
It does.
And, I think that's one of the things that people are really. It's such a hypocritical thing that alcohol would be legal in America and these other things that don't cause any damage at all are illegal. It's like nobody is taking ayahuasca and getting in their car and plowing down 3 people because they're too intoxicated to drive. Like nobody's doing that.
Yeah, Exactly. I like McKenna's book, Food of the Gods, and where he talks about different societies and civilizations and their drugs of choice that they interact with, and how
Hmm.
it is
Yes.
very tied into the agenda of that particular society or civilization. Like coffee. Coffee is for industrialized society where we need to be motivated. We need to wake ourselves up way much too early. Uh,
Yes.
and
Wait.
be on point immediately to get all of our tasks done, to get all the cogs and wheels moving along, and beer to completely numb ourselves and put an arm's length between us and everything that is I don't know. I don't mean to demonize alcohol, but there's more bad stories than good stories, I think, that come out of alcohol at this point.
Yeah, it's a shame because I don't think that. I mean, it's not the alcohol that's doing it;
Of
it's
course.
people.
Yeah.
And the problem is that it is so available and it is so normal that it's like, yeah, somebody will drink and then get behind the wheel of a car, whereas mushrooms are not normalized. So people aren't typically. I mean, maybe somebody out there is doing it. I don't know, but people typically aren't eating mushrooms and going and driving. They eat mushrooms like, yeah, to get behind the wheel of a car is a really stupid idea right now. Whereas, with somebody drinking, it's like, oh, I'll be fine, whatever. But I feel you, Chris. And then in the 50s, I mean, we like amphetamines where you just go to your pharmacy and you got a fucking methamphetamine. Like, and again, like coffee, it's like that's such an American drug. It's like, yep, be on point, be ready to go. It doesn't matter how much you're dying inside, don't just push that aside because material possessions is the road to happiness. So if you drink your coffee and you take your methamphetamine, you can fucking go to work, you can buy your material possessions, and then you can drink alcohol at night and forget your fucking life.
Exactly. Which goes hand in hand with the bigger philosophy and worldview of materialism and scientific rationalism. And it fits together so well,
Yeah, right.
Yeah.
And I mean, I think, well, one of the things we're learning now is that, material goods are not making anybody happy. Like they're not filling anybody. And I think that we're in a crisis of purpose in this country. And I mean, I think psychedelics actually help with that personally. But yeah, people aren't happy because, the promises of just really like, I don't know how to put it, but like just unchecked profit motives are just, you don't feel good at the end of the day when you're walking all over people.
Yeah.
Doesn't matter if walking all over people gets you that Mercedes. Unless you're a sociopath, you're not feeling too good at the end of the day.
Which is, is where alcohol comes in handy, to numb that pain.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Exactly. That's what it does for you.
Yes.
And it gives you a moral sense of superiority. Oh, well, I'm not doing that illegal stuff. I'm not a hippie dropout smoking grass. I'm drinking alcohol. It's whatever.
Yeah. Yeah. It's ridiculous. It's totally ridiculous. Anyway, we could literally go on about that for a long time. Maybe we'll just have a bitching about the war on drugs episode at some point, but
yeah, right. I'd love to anytime.
Okay, fantastic. I want to say thank you so much, Thomas, for taking this time out to speak with me. And the book was fantastic. I highly recommend it to anybody. Where can people find you and contact you and have access to your books?
Sure. So my main website is psychedelichistoриan.com. But in 1 month, by like the end of April, psychedelichistoryproject.com, I have this amazing cache of psychedelic literature from the late 1800s all the way up to and including the 1960s on everything from cannabis to the first encounters with peyote and mescaline and LSD and the clandestine CIA tests with LSD and just mushrooms and psilocybin, all that stuff. That's going to be on psychedelichistoryproject.com. There's literally, thousands of papers. It's going to be the world's largest repository of online psychedelic literature.
Oh, that's exciting.
Excuse me, the world's largest online repository, of psychedelic literature. And so yeah, that'll be psychedelichistoryproject.com in about a month. Facebook.com/psychedelic historian, YouTube. I don't have enough followers yet on YouTube to have my own YouTube like page, but if you put in psychedelic historian, I'll be the one that comes up. And on Instagram, psychedelic historian.
Fantastic. I will put the links to that in the episode notes.
Great. Thank you so much, Chris.
Absolutely. And you mentioned a new book that is going to be coming out in about a year, right?
Yes.
Yes.
Yeah. The working title. Oh, what?
No, go ahead. What? Tell us a little bit about it.
Sure. Sorry about that. The working title is Wonder Child, LSD before the psychedelic 60s. And it pretty much shines a light and puts a microscope on the 1950s, which is actually the decade that created all of the things we associate with psychedelia in the modern world, and all the things we associate with the psychedelic 60s actually happened a decade earlier in the 1950s. Just not enough people had television yet. So it didn't spread until the 1960s, but the ideas actually formed in the 1950s. So I go over all of that. It's just a quick example. We all know about dose, set, and setting. Well, one of the things I show in the book is how actually dose, set, and setting evolved at 3 different times in 3 different places in the 1950s. Only later in the 1960s, Leary put the 3 of them together, and we always associate them, but as one thing. But there was a time when all 3 things were very different.
Interesting. That sounds great.
So, yeah, and there's a lot of just stuff like that. I get into also a lot more women that were involved in the psychedelic renaissance, and, how instrumental they were. Rosalind Haywood, for example. Like, everybody knows about Aldous Huxley and his famous mystical experiences, but nobody talks about Rosalind Haywood, who actually, 2 years before Huxley was writing all about the mystical state of LSD and mescaline. So I'm bringing characters like her, back to life. Everybody knows about Humphrey Osmond, who was the guy who coined the word psychedelic, but not a lot of people know about Frank Takesgun, who was the Red Pheasant chief that gave Osmond peyote and let him sit in on a native peyote ceremony. So that's also in the book.
Cool.
So, yeah, I get into all that stuff.
Well,
just the lost history of psychedelia from the 50s.
Fantastic. Well, I will certainly have you back for that, for sure.
Oh, I can't wait. Yeah. This was great.
Yes, likewise. Again, thank you so much, Thomas. And I will let you know when this episode is out, and I'll send you the links and stuff like that. But it's probably going to be around a month anyway. So I will include the link to the website that you mentioned, and hopefully it'll be up and running by then. So
it will be. So thank you so much. I appreciate it.
What an enjoyable chat with an enjoyable chap. Thomas was a very easy guy to talk to. And what a really thoroughly informative book. Psychedelic Mystery Traditions, Spirit Plants, Magical Practices, and Ecstatic States on Inner Traditions. Chock full of information on a subject that I'm pretty well versed in. And Thomas brought a lot of new stuff to the table and put some things in different contexts that I'd never seen laid out quite like that before. So I highly recommend it if you're into the connection between entheogens and religion or mystery schools. Definitely check this book out. If you like what you hear so much that you would like to help out and contribute, you can go to www.patreon.com/themeltpodcast. And there you will find ways to contribute from $1 up per month. Any little bit helps. I've got a Zoom bill that I have to pay every month. I've got the software that I use to create my episode art subscription that I have to pay every month. I would love to upgrade equipment. I would love to travel for some of these interviews. I really would love to branch this out into something much bigger than it is, but I can't do it with the time I have allotted because of my other work that brings in money but is not my passion. And the time that it takes to do this. It just takes a lot of time. So I would love to make this my sole job, my sole occupation, because it's the thing that I feel the strongest about as far as my creative endeavors in my life right now. So, yeah, go and chip in $1 a month would be tremendously helpful in many ways, financially and karmically. And if you can't do that, which I totally understand, you can also contribute by just spreading the word, leaving a good review or a good rating on whatever podcatcher you happen to get the melt on. Then that could be iTunes. Well, I guess it's not iTunes anymore. I guess it's just called Podcasts, Apple Podcasts, Google Play, Stitcher, the like. Leave a review, rate it, share it on your social media info harvesting website of choice. Any of these things would help out so much. Just email the link to a friend that you think might appreciate it. And also, speaking of emails, feel free to send me an email at themeltpodcast@gmail.com containing stories. I am looking for listeners' stories about their firsthand experiences with the kinds of things that we talk about here on The Melt. And hopefully, potentially, they can be included in future episodes. All right. Thank you all so much. I appreciate you. And again, spread the word, spread the love. These are strange times, but let's don't use it to isolate ourselves. Let's use it in a monastic way to better ourselves so that when we can come back out into the world, we will be the better for it. All right. Love to you all, and until next time, please take care.